pierwsza sesja jest poświęcona przeglądowi światowych i krajowych działań w zakresie pola elektromagnetycznego i ich oddziaływania na ludzki organizm oraz na budowę sieci piątej generacji, sieci 5G. Jako pierwszego mówcę chciałbym zaprosić pana doktora Zenona Sienkiewicza, który reprezentuje znaną nam wszystkim instytucję, jaką jest ICNIRP, czyli Międzynarodowa Instytucja do ochrony przed promieniowaniem niejonizującym. Pan doktor Sienkiewicz ukończył Chelsea College, uzyskał licencjat z fizjologii, tytuł doktora na Queen Mary College na Uniwersytecie Londyńskim, studiował neurofizjologię na Wydziale Psychologii Eksperymentalnej na Uniwersytecie Oksfordzkim. Dr. Sienkiewicz, the floor is yours.
Right, good morning everybody. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you today. I'm representing ICNIRP, which I'm sure you can read is the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. We are an international association of independent scientists whose aim is to provide advice, and we do this primarily through producing guidelines. And today I'd like to talk about the revised guidelines we're still producing on radio frequency fields. So we're not specifically talking about 5G, but I'm talking about all radio frequencies. Right. Now the scope of our guidelines you can see here. We go everywhere from 100 kilohertz up to 300 gigahertz. So it's a large part of the spectrum. We initially produced our guidelines in 1998. And then about 5 years ago, we started to revise them. It's been a long and complicated sort of path, and where I think we're at the final bend towards the finishing line. But what we wanted to do was provide protection against adverse effects under realistic conditions. We wanted to consider both public and occupational exposures, and we wanted to consider both direct effects of the field on the body and indirect effects. What we don't include, as you can see here, are effects on electromagnetic interference, the exposures for medical purposes, or how you do measurements for compliance. They are outside sort of ICNIRP's sort of remit. Good. Now, what is our current status? Well, in July, we put the guidelines consisting of a main document plus 2 appendices on the internet, on our website, and we invited everyone in the world to come and give us their opinions. And certainly the world did. We had about 120 different individuals or organizations writing quite extensive numbers of questions. Altogether, we had over 1,000 comments. Some were very simple, like line 3 on page 4 needs a full stop or a comma. They're easily addressed. Others were far more complicated, where we'd actually interpreted Maxwell's equations incorrectly, and they have taken a lot more sort of deliberation and thought. And that's exactly what's happening now. We are slowly moving through all the comments, and we are substantially revising the draft. I would have liked to present you the final version today, but since we haven't quite got there yet, it would be remiss of me to do so. So what I'm doing is actually more presenting what we published back in July. Oh, I've done it again. The first step in any guideline is to identify exactly what exposure causes. So we had to look at all the literature, all the published reviews, as well as independently published papers, to try and see what effects were adverse to humans. Where could we see there was an actual effect? 2 things we were concerned about was that the effects were scientifically substantiated. And this is a term ICNIRP has started to use. And we mean that they had independent replication if possible. The studies were of sufficient quality that we could believe them. And very important, they were, if you like, scientifically explicable, that they made sense with the laws of physics and the laws of biology. We wanted something which was real, could be reproduced in laboratories, and had an actual effect on humans. Once we'd identified what the effects were, we really tried to see, could we see a threshold? And this is exactly what we wanted to try and do, to try and find the minimum threshold, the minimum exposure that caused the health effect. Where we had sufficient information from the RF sort of bioelectromagnetics field, we were content to use that. Unfortunately, for a lot of the work, now we've been researching RF fields for what, 50, 60 years? There really was still insufficient data in certain areas. And particularly there, we actually went to other fields. And in this area, we actually went to the thermophysiology field, as you will see, because as we all know, microwaves and RF fields actually cause heating. Where we use this additional evidence, we called it the operational adverse health effect. But in effect, we were just using the best information we can to try and find where the thresholds exist. And as I said, here's the current status. Our public consultation closed in October, and the revision is now underway. Where am I going? I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. Once we've actually identified the thing has a backwards leaning thing. Once we identified what the thresholds were, we had to derive the basic restrictions from it. And what we do is we find the threshold and we apply a reduction factor, a safety factor, if you will, which allows people or in the public or members of, or workers to actually be exposed. And we do this simply because we don't have omnipotence. We don't know all the answers. There's a lot of scientific uncertainty. There's a lot of variation between individuals, whether you're old or young, pregnant or not, whether you've got a disease or not. And in terms of public health, we have to take this into account. So our reduction factors should allow for that. We also try to have a consistency in our reduction factors. So if you look at other ICNIRP guidelines, the reduction factor is often 5, 10 or 2. Simply because they're values that we use. And there we try to actually maintain that sort of regimen this time. Generally, the reduction factors to the general public are higher than those for the occupation exposures. In other words, the workers can be exposed at a higher level. Simply because we believe that the worker can be told, can be trained, can have protective equipment if we need it. They can actually mitigate themselves against the risk of harm. Members of the public can't do this. I would not expect your grandmother in her kitchen to know what the effects of RF and therefore take appropriate action. It's just not appropriate. And also we consider the variation in sensitivity could be larger in the general public. It could be an age, it could be due to disease, it could be to medications. Once we've got the basic restrictions, which are internal biological quantities, we have to derive an external field strength. This we call the reference level. This is very complicated, and please don't ask me how we do this because I'm a biologist, I'm not a mathematician or a dosimetry person, but we actually have to provide a practical measure of taking the external field and how it relates to the internal field inside of people. We have to be realistic in our exposures, and as I say here, that we actually cover most situations, but not all possible situations. One criticism was that we had a 3 foot high, a meter high person who raised their hands and stood that way for a couple of hours. They could exceed our basic restriction. Well, I don't know many people who are 1 meter high who are going to stand in a field with their hands up for more than an hour to do that. So, and as we say, that's probably not a realistic exposure, and we haven't allowed for that. Otherwise, we've just become too restrictive, and I don't think anybody wants that. What is the scientific basis of our guidelines? Well, we used the draft environmental health criteria, which came from the World Health Organization, the Sesja document, and I do apologize, I've actually seen now the acronym for Sesja is written wrong. It's the Scientific Committee on New and Emerging Health Risks. Plus, we had original papers which have been published since about 2015. It's a huge body of literature there. It goes from cellular biology through to cancer epidemiology, so a lot of biological endpoints. And we were looking for evidence of harm. And we found that there was 4 areas where you might get effects. Temperature elevation, which is the obvious one. The microwave hearing phenomena, where you hear this hissing, popping or clicking sound. That is clearly related to a local thermal effect, but we don't consider it harmful. You really do need specialized, very, very noise-free conditions to actually hear it. And so unlike 1998, we have no restrictions specifically to avoid that phenomenon. We have electrostimulation, which occurs in the low part of the RF frequency, but that is actually covered by the 2010 guidelines on extremely low frequency fields from ICNIRP, and so our guidelines now no longer consider it. And finally, we have the phenomenon of electroporation. Now, that only actually occurs at very, 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 very high electric fields. This is where a membrane can be made temporarily porous. We know it happens with very intense DC fields. The same should happen here. But we don't think it's a problem in practice, so we haven't had any restrictions on that either. So what have we based our scientific on? It is mainly heating. Many of you may have heard of the NTP study or the Falcioni studies, where animals are exposed to microwaves or to mobile phone signals for a lifetime. Some people have said this actually is convincing evidence of cancer induction. ICNIRP has done a 6 or 7 page critique, which is on our website. I urge you to look at it if you haven't done so. But we really are unconvinced that those studies do actually suggest that exposure to any form of RF actually causes cancer. The numbers of animals, with cancer are incredibly small, and almost by random errors, you could probably get the same results. So we concluded that there's no evidence that RF fields impact health beyond the effects that are due to established mechanisms, and that mechanism is due to heating. And as I said, we consulted the thermophysiology literature to actually help us with that deliberation. Now, we know temperature represents health effects, so we're primarily going to set temperatures that stop an increase in temperature. We're actually trying to limit the amount of temperature that your tissues can be raised above what is a normal thermal baseline state. Now, many of you know that the mean body core temperature is roughly about 37 degrees. It varies by about half a degree to 1 degree throughout the day. And we have all manner of mechanisms, from behavior, taking our coats off when we're hot, to actually putting more blood through to our skin, to actually sweating, to try and maintain our temperature at this core level. We are very efficient at doing that, and as a sort of hairless primate, we are really good at thermoregulating. But we do know that once your core body temperature rises by 1 degree to 38, things start to go awry. And you can actually have effects of heat stroke, and certainly for workers, the accident rate increases. And I know ICNIRP has been saying this for many years, but I think it is absolutely true. So we've actually defined an increase in core body temperature of 1 degree as our operational threshold. We say you should not be exposed above that level. And this is entirely consistent with American guidelines for workers in hot environments. So ICNIRP for EMF is actually applying the same sort of ideas as workers in other industries actually apply. Now, can we relate that to the field? Well, we know from modelling studies that a human, under certain conditions, has to be exposed to about 6 watts per kilogram over the whole body to actually have a 1 degree increase in temperature. Well, ICNIRP takes that as a good estimate, but we actually feel we need to be more conservative. So we've actually suggested that we have a whole body average SAR of 4 watts per kilogram. Over the whole body, so averaged over 30 minutes should not lead to a further increase in temperature of 1 degree. And if you like, that is our operational health threat. As I said, it is very conservative. Me standing here is generating 1 to 2 watts per kilogram. If I was walking around, I'd be generating a few more, and if I was doing exercise, I could do 12 to 15 watts per kilogram. So you can see that 4 watts per kilogram is not a huge sort of energy deposition. Is that right? Yes. In 1998, we had an SAR up to 10 gigahertz. Now we've actually got a whole body SAR up to 300 gigahertz, the same again, with a local SAR for the hands, the limbs, the heads, and the torso up to 6 kilograms, and at the higher part of the spectrum, we actually talk about where the energy is just being absorbed more superficially. We have what's here called transmitted power density, but several comments actually said that's the wrong word to use. So probably in the final version, that would be called absorbed power density, to reflect that the energy is being absorbed more superficially. We also know that you don't only get whole body exposure, certainly in industrial situations, but you get local exposures. And here we're trying to present damage to the tissues and the cells. And we know that temperatures above 41, 42, 43 for a sufficient amount of time can cause damage. And what we actually did was we thought, well, how can we protect the tissues? Well, we divided the tissues into 2 types, type 1 and type 2. And as you can see here, the type 1 tissues actually are tending to be colder. Their temperature is, on the whole, lower than 37. And we allow them to be raised by a factor of 5 degrees to keep them below the operational threshold. Type 2 tissues, and again you can see here, tend to have a higher temperature, and they can only be raised by a factor of about 2 degrees. So in both types of tissue, we're actually saying it is the increase to this theoretical level, which is what we're protecting against. Now, unfortunately, you can't really give a guideline based on specific tissues. So what we've done, we sort of homogenized these into 2 sort of regions. One we call the head and torso, and the others we call the limbs. And again, you can see in the description, the head and torso is the head, eye, abdomen, back, thorax, and pelvis, and the limbs are the hands, the forearms, the upper arm, the thigh, leg, and the foot. And if you're very clever and you remember what I've just written, you'll see that type 1 and 2 tissues are in the head and torso, but only type 1 tissues are in the limbs. So the limbs can actually be raised by a higher level than the head and torso. What about the averaging mass? Well, the mathematicians and dosimetrists always argue about what we should use to calculate the whole body SAR. We're actually using a 10 gram cubic mass, because we think it provides a better match with temperature increase than using contiguous tissue. Again, a lot of concern, a lot of advice, a lot of comments, exactly what the size and the shape of the averaging mass should be. Oh, that's right. What is our sort of effect levels? As you can see here in red, that we're thinking that for the head and torso, you can have an average SAR of about 20 watts per kilogram, no real change there, averaged over 6 minutes, and about 40 watts per kilogram over 6 minutes in the limbs. As I said, the limbs generally are colder. At a higher frequency, we tend to use this now absorbed power density, and indeed it is possible that at the higher end of that 6 to 300, we may actually increase the value as well. Simply because we have an averaging area of change between 6 and 30 gigahertz for 4 centimeters square, and at 30 to 300 for 1 centimeters, simply reflect the difference in absorption and the physics and how it's affected. So it is possible at 30 to 300 gigahertz we could have 400 watts per square meter in the final version. But here again, we are trying to limit the increase in tissue temperature in the head and torso and in the limbs. For some situations, we have to limit the contact currents, and the amount of evidence we have for this is extremely limited. The effect is of pain, that when you touch something, you feel pain. Generally, the results for a threshold, which again, it really is one study, suggests that 20 milliamps is what you would need for adults and half that for a child to feel pain. So we have a guideline with that. Here's a very complicated table with the differences between the 1998 ones. You'll see there isn't a massive difference there. I mean, the averaging time for the core temperature, the whole body SAR, has gone from 6 minutes to 30 minutes, which you think is biologically more relevant. And apart from that, there are 1 or 2 tweaks. But the main, I think, of the SARs are much the same as they have been. So all the research that's been done since 1998 hasn't actually altered the basis for our guidelines. In fact, most of the improvements have come through the dosimetry, not through the biology or the health effects. We then compute reference levels based upon these basic restrictions, which again is this magic that dosimetry people do. And again, you can see here we have whole body far field, local far field, and local far field for 6 or 6 minutes less, more than 6 minutes or less than 6 minutes. Less than 6 minutes is done to account for like pulsed exposures. We're actually saying you can be exposed for a sort amount. Where you actually get resonance near body resonance of body sort of size, we actually do have to consider limb currents as well. And again, we've actually got another reference level for that, as we had before. If you look at the values, you can see here the low frequency guidelines, the 98 guidelines and the 2018 ones. And if you want to be compliant, you really do want to stay below any of those lines. So you would follow the red line to hit the green line, then go to the blue line, and so forth and so on. That is where the guidelines lead. And again, reference levels for shorter fields has slightly become less restrictive than they were before. But I sort of urge you to look at the guideline and the figures to actually work out whether or not it helps you in an industry or not. As I said, this is an ongoing revision. I'm sorry I can't give you the final version yet, but we have had intense discussion of all the comments, and we are trying to incorporate all the changes to try and get a very consistent and useful document to everybody. At the current time, we anticipate the revised guidelines will be published probably in middle of next year. We hope to have them finished internally, submitted to Health Physics, the journal, so hopefully towards the middle of next year they will be published. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and my one piece of Polish. Okay, thank you.